Good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is the third in a series of virtual executive seminars organized by the African Leadership Academy. The Executive Seminar Series is one of the signature programs that ALA has to support the development of its young leaders on campus. The seminars are now taking place virtually, so the rest of us can tune in. My name is Ratinoi Kuntai. I am an alumni of the ALA from the class of 2015. I'm currently in my final year of a law degree at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Our guest today is Justice Edwin Cameron. I've had the opportunity to hear him speak about 4 years ago while I was still a student at ALA, and it's an honor and pleasure to be reconnecting with him in this way.
Wonderful to be with you, Ratinoi, and to be with our audience as well. I'm looking forward to quite an intense and exciting engagement.
Thank you. Justice Edwin Cameron served as judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa between 2008 and 2019. He has previously served as a judge in the High Court and Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa as well. His professional work and activism were instrumental in securing the express inclusion of sexual orientation in the South African Constitution and advocating for the rights and protections of people infected with HIV. He's a well-published author and has received numerous prestigious accolades, including the Nelson Mandela Award for Health and Human Rights. He's currently serving as the inspecting judge of the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, which is an institution tasked with protecting the prisoners' rights. His professional background and life's work make him an important contributor to the discourse around human rights and public health as they relate to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which is our topic of discussion this evening. Before I invite Justice Cameron, I'd like to speak about the outline of the evening. It's going to be divided into two parts. I will be interviewing Justice Cameron for the first 25 minutes of the webinar. We will then dedicate just over 30 minutes to answering questions from the audience. I'd like to encourage everyone to contribute to the Q&A section and make use of the thumbs up function under any question you would like to be answered. We will be giving priority to the questions with more likes in them. Also, feel free to start a dialogue in the comment section and respond to each other's questions. We will endeavor to answer as many questions as we can, but we would like to encourage you to answer each other and speak in the comment section. So on to our first section, our first question for this evening. I'd like to begin on a general note by asking Justice Cameron what role he thinks the law and human rights discourse have to play in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over to you, Justice Cameron.
Thank you so much, Ratinoi. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted that I'm sharing the platform in front of our audience this evening with you. Let us start by something that's happening right now in our townships and our peri-urban and non-suburban areas, which is that we are getting many reports of heavy-handedness against the poor people who are at risk in this epidemic. And of course, that brings acutely to the fore the question of human rights, because human rights have not gone into abeyance simply because we are facing a national disaster. Even when there's a state of emergency, the Bill of Rights prescribes very minutely what rights are inalienable, what rights cannot be suspended at all. For example, the right to human dignity. So if you're sitting in your front yard in Alex Township and you're having a drink in a chair there and soldiers burst in, even if this were a state of emergency, which it's not, you retain your dignity and cannot be mishandled in that way. But the deeper point really is this, Ratinoi, which is that we cannot face down any grave threat to our humanity, whether it's viral or anything else, without respecting people's own humanity. And that involves respecting their rights. And we cannot get the community on side in either this epidemic or in any other mass pandemic without being respectful of their rights. Now, that is a message that we can come to later if your participants want to ask about it. We learned that at great cost in the AIDS epidemic, that you do not secure the rights of some by trampling on the rights of those at risk and those with a virus. You secure the rights of everyone by respecting the rights of everyone. That's a profound lesson, and it's one that we should be following right now in this terrifying pandemic.
Thank you very much for your answer. And it's right. So now we have placed the human rights and public health in the center of our discourse, and we know why it's relevant. I'd like to speak to you about your work. A lot of your work has been to mobilize support, raise awareness, and make provisions for people infected with HIV. The stigmatization of infected people is a big deterrent to promoting their health and safety. So what does our continent's experience with AIDS and the stigma tell us about the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, the infuriating paradox about HIV is that it suffered and still does suffer enormous stigma. I think many of our participants this evening have got family members, cousins, brothers, sisters, parents, siblings, partners who are affected by HIV, possibly living with HIV themselves. It's a very, very difficult virus to transmit. It's at the opposite end of viral transmissibility from COVID. But despite that, it had enormous stigma. So stigma has a functional role in human society. If there's a leprosy outbreak or cholera or COVID, you're rightly scared of contagion, and therefore you're careful of someone who could pass it on to you. But with HIV, in 99% of cases, it required an act, not just of sexual intimacy, but an actual act of sexual union, of intercourse, unprotected ejaculative intercourse to pass it on. COVID is very different. And yet what both epidemics have in common is that the marginalized, the oppressed, the dispossessed are very heavily affected here. And the burden of the epidemic falls on them in layers. It falls on them in their risk of infection. It falls on them in how heavy it is once they're infected. And it also falls on them in the heaviness of societal responses to it. So in HIV, we can spin this out quite a bit, but I want to be succinct so that we can take as many questions as possible, Ratinoi. Yes. But in HIV, the marginalized and the stigmatized started in America with people like myself, proudly and openly gay men in the early 1980s. I came out as a gay man at about that time. I was in my early 30s. I was starting in my human rights practice as an advocate in Johannesburg. And all across the western east coasts of America, young men in their 30s, gay men like myself, were dying. And I contracted the virus myself at that point. And of course, stigma played a massive part in the response of the Reagan presidency, which was unscientific. Now, if there are any Americans in our audience or American schooled people, what do we have right now? We have an unscientific president, grotesquely worse than Ronald Reagan, who is ignoring the science, ignoring the rational scientific indicators of dealing with this epidemic. But of course, the stigma was very different in Africa, Ratinoi. The stigma in Africa was about people's blackness and their poverty. People very different from myself, people who were opposite sex oriented, people who weren't in my affluent circumstances. And that dictated the path of the epidemic on our continent until, as activists, we changed that path. And that's something that we can discuss as well if your audience would like to talk about that. So the parallel I'll draw is that those at gravest risk of viral contagion are always the poor, the marginalized, and the dispossessed in society. And in the AIDS epidemic and the COVID epidemic, in both cases on our continent, most terribly at risk are Black poor people.
Thank you. And in the same spirit of speaking about how this virus, the HIV virus and also the COVID-19 virus, affects different classes of people uniquely, I'd like you to talk about how concepts of race, class, and racial stereotyping and our learnings from HIV and those concepts, how we can contribute that to our understanding of the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's a great question, and I was very glad that you proposed it when we worked towards this evening, Ratinoi, because I think the one lesson of effective pandemic response is that it's got to be a community response. It's got to be a response rooted in community legitimacy. It's got to be a response rooted in community consent, which is why the misdeeds of the SANDF and of the South African police in our townships are so grievous in this epidemic. But I think that you gain that consent through applying science, through approaching people with information, with treating them as agents and not applying stereotypes to them. So here we are all at risk. That was the lesson of HIV. And another lesson, of course, one that the current president of the United States does not appear to accept, is that viruses do not know borders. We in South Africa thought that because we're at the southern tip, we were not going to be affected like Uganda. In the end, South Africa, Swaziland, and Botswana had the 3 highest national prevalences anywhere in the world. And South Africa is still the country with the highest number of people living with HIV, 7.5 million of any country in the world. And the same applies to COVID. You can't say it's the Chinese or the Mexicans or the cross-border migrants or the refugees or the asylum seekers. It's all of us. So in all of those ways, it is terribly damaging to stigmatize people. And it's not only a rights infringement and a dignity infringement, it also makes very bad public health sense.
Thank you very much. Moving on to issues of patents and intellectual property rights, I'd like to start by saying that the current priority for all countries is to find a vaccine or a cure for the COVID-19 virus. This makes patent and other intellectual property laws important factors which will affect the availability of these medications for everyone once they are found and if they are found. So speak to us about how patent and intellectual property laws could inhibit access to public health and how this will affect the availability of the vaccines, if they are found. Thank you.
Well, let me start, Ratinoi, with October 2001. It's a terrifying time. It's a month after the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in Manhattan. And letters are sent through the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Post offices with anthrax. Now, anthrax is a most terrifying spore, and it's deadly. What did the United States do? It immediately suspended all patent laws. It said, we are going to deal with the risk of a mass affliction of anthrax. Now, at the same time, the United States was leaning on countries like South Africa and India to, quote unquote, respect the patent laws. It was grievous, it was inconsistent, it was unfair, it was immoral. Now, the immorality of the intellectual property system in relation to human illness is that we are all equally vulnerable. We are all vulnerable, whether to cancer or to river blindness, not equally vulnerable. I don't mean that, of course, it's environmentally located. Of course, there are personal predispositions and risks. But as humans, we are all equally vulnerable. So why should the benefit of medical advances not be made available to everyone? We are brought up to think that the patent system was descended upon human society from above. If you come from a faith-based system of belief, you'd think it comes from God. Well, it didn't. It came very recently in the last few hundred years from human ingenuity designed to accumulate wealth, rightly to a limited extent, to engender research and development, R&D. But there are much better ways to do that. Professor Thomas Podgy at Yale University has proposed an international innovation fund where you lavishly reward people for their innovations, for their intellectual inventiveness, based on their practical effect, on the number of people they help. So someone who provides a cure for baldness, for example, will get much less than someone who provides an effective antidote to malaria, which affects, and TB, which affects many, many tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Africans on our continent. Now, that would be a proper system of rewarding ingenuity. So the patent system has been a great offense against proper public health management. And of course, the most distended example of that, grievously, is the fact that the United States still doesn't have a national public health system. And it's a great debate in the United States, something that excites the rage of the far right-wing ideologues in the United States. But we should. in a human society, in a human society guided by compassion and dignity, we would make available to all people in peril of illness and suffering and death the fruits of humankind's intellectual advances, and we would lavishly reward those people who provided us with those innovations, but not in the present way. Under AIDS, the great advances were secured. This is sometimes forgotten by the activists in the United States, not only by the United States activists, but by the activists of the Treatment Action Campaign, Zaki Ahmed and other South Africans, who took on the drug companies, who said it is utterly, incomprehensibly and unspeakably immoral that you should have treatments that are effective for AIDS. I've been on those treatments now for 22 years. That's why I'm here this evening, because I'm on successful antiretroviral therapy. But the drug companies wanted to say, well, you can have them in Africa as long as you pay $6,000 a month, when people in Africa were living on $1 a day. So they tackled that. They faced down the drug companies. The drug companies rightly in 2002 accommodated the AIDS epidemic. And that should happen with every epidemic, as it did with the anthrax scare in 2001 on the East Coast of America. And as it is happening, I might as well say, with COVID right now. That is the proper approach, that you make the findings available for the benefit of everyone at risk.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree with you fully. All our lives are the same, equal, and they all need to be protected, and the law needs to stand by that stance and make sure.
And you say that as a lawyer, Ratinoi?
Yes, I do.
You say that as a lawyer?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm glad.
Okay. I'd like to move on to your job. Currently, you're the inspecting judge of prisons, and your work concerns incarcerated populations in South Africa. So how does COVID-19 affect prisons in a unique way, and what should be done to ensure that prisoners are protected in this pandemic?
Thank you, Ratinoi. It's a disaster. Our country has declared it a national disaster. We've had 3 or 4 presidential addresses. We're going to get another one tonight. But it's a worse disaster for prisons. And it's an even worse disaster for an overcrowded prison system. We are not as bad as the carceral system of the United States, which I think has still got somewhere between 1 and 2 million people in it. But we are the 12th highest in terms of the number of people we incarcerate, 150,000 people in South Africa. Our jails are built to take only 2/3 of that number. So our whole carceral system is desperately overcrowded. Now, how do you practice physical distancing, social spacing within a prison? You can't. How do you take care for your own hygiene if you haven't got sanitizers, if you haven't got water, if you're sharing a toilet with 50 other people? It's desperate. So the carceral systems of all countries accentuate the difficulties, the risks, and the catastrophic effects of this epidemic. For that reason, this evening, I, joined by the Detention Justice Forum of South Africa, a number of organizations involved in prisons reform, have made a public call on our Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Minister Ronald Lamola, who I think is sympathetic to this, but it's been quite a few weeks since these proposals have been going around. We've asked him to secure a significant intervention to release people to decongest our prisons. Many states in the US have done it. Iran has done it. I think that the repressive nature of the Iranian carceral system may be compared in certain respects to the terrible repression of some aspects of the United States carceral system, but both have done it. So South Africa should do it as well. That's a point we've made to the minister.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I'd like to speak about our health systems now. So this pandemic is a stark reminder that most African countries have weak and inaccessible health systems. The solution to this would be to invest more in developing our healthcare systems through research, improving accessibility, national budget allocation, etc. Are there any legal mechanisms that would oblige African countries to focus on strengthening their healthcare systems? Because as of now, most African countries are not allocating enough of their budget to developing their healthcare systems? Or alternatively, can African countries hold themselves accountable to this goal, and what role do citizens play in achieving this?
It's an interesting question because Professor Larry Gostin at the Georgetown Law Center in Washington, D.C. has been working for quite a few years on trying to get the international right to healthcare and health established, and to have an international treaty, international law instrument, which would embody this right. And he's made progress on that. Of course, everything right at the moment has been frozen because of the catastrophic effects of this virus. It's interesting that you ask me, are there rights that can be enforced against African countries that are not doing what they should? Well, in South Africa, in Section 27 of our Bill of Rights, we've got the right to healthcare, the right of access to healthcare. And it was this right that Zaki Ahmed and the Treatment Action Campaign used when President Mbeki refused to make antiretroviral treatment available. They took him to court. They pleaded with him first. They demonstrated, they mobilized the country in the terrible midst of the fatalities inflicted by the AIDS epidemic. And when he was intransigent, they took him to court. And in one of its best decisions in the last 25 years, the Constitutional Court ordered President Mbeki, despite his own adherence to many principles of AIDS denialism, despite his refusal to accept science and the logic of empiricism, the Constitutional Court ordered him to start making antiretroviral treatment available. And the consequence is that South Africa now has the world's largest publicly provided antiretroviral treatment program. I'm one of nearly 4 million people who are living on antiretrovirals. So I want to get back to the point I was making, if I may, Ratinoi, which is that this shows the utility of legal rights, but of course legal rights aren't always the only, or sometimes they're not even the best way of securing respect for people's entitlements as humans. Now, I don't know the constitutional format of many African countries, but I know that the rights of dignity, the rights of equality, any country that professes to have a constitutional system and respect for constitutionalism should be making adequate provision for healthcare. And many countries that don't, if they gave less attention to elite entitlements, as we in Africa and elsewhere do far too quickly, would be able to make far more provision for adequate healthcare.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't announce this before we got to this point, but I'd like to now move on to the Q&A section. We have a lot of questions and a very engaging audience today. So if that's okay with you, we'll start with our questions. So we have an anonymous attendee who's asking a question, and it says, employees are refusing to go to the office for fear of contracting the virus and exposing their families to the disease as well. So what are their rights in this regard?
Ratinoi, is the question about someone who has got the virus?
No, it's about someone who's just making, I think, a public observation of employees who could perhaps have to go to work because the office still requires it, but they fear contracting the virus and also passing it on to their families. Correct. So yeah, I think that's more with employment rights, and employment contracts.
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Employment rights and also rights to adequate healthcare. The right to my healthcare sometimes depends on giving me adequate means to protect myself from infection. So I live in a middle-class area of Johannesburg. The places where I shop include a place much maligned amongst those who like to lampoon the middle classes, which is called Woolworths. Until last week, the till assistants at Woolworths didn't have masks. And I think that's completely wrong. So we are asking people, essential services include food provision. Those cashiers at my Woolworths in my area of Johannesburg are essential service workers, no more than the people who are keeping our electricity, who are picking up our refuse, and who are keeping us safe. So there's absolutely no doubt that everyone who is required to work during this epidemic should have protective equipment and preventive equipment, PPE. They should have masks, adequate masks. They should have sanitizer. They should be able to protect themselves. There's no doubt. And if a company hasn't done so, I didn't want to particularly single out Woolworths, but that's the last time that I saw essential service workers unprotected. They should provide those immediately and without stint.
Okay, so we're getting a lot of questions about employment and employees' rights. So the next question is about employers laying off a lot of their workers during this pandemic, obviously for financial reasons, but can employees take any legal action against their employers for laying them off?
It's very difficult when retrenchment occurs. Retrenchment is different from a misconduct or an incapacity termination. Retrenchment means that the employer has established that the employer simply cannot go on, that the employer doesn't have the means to pay the workers, or the employer isn't doing the kind of work anymore because the market has fallen away. No one's buying my product anymore. I've got to close down. So the rights of employees in those circumstances are almost exclusively procedural. If the retrenchment exercise is authentic, if it isn't inauthentic, if the employer isn't using the retrenchment exercise as a cover to get rid of an unwanted employee or as a cover to get rid of the union, then it's very difficult. Then you can insist on fair process. Who are you going to select? How many are you going to select? And what retrenchment packages are you going to pay? And all of those process steps have to be followed.
Okay. The next question is about vulnerable people when it comes to the virus, such as homeless people, other classes of vulnerable people. And I think we can put into that group all the citizens, women who make up the bulk of the healthcare system. And particularly this question is about homeless people. So they're being relocated to temporary shelters in South Africa, I believe. But yeah, just speak about the government and how their rights of protection for these vulnerable classes of people, such as homeless people. Yeah.
It's a difficult one for me. Just 8 months ago, when I was still in the Constitutional Court, I would have been careful not to answer this question because the case might have come up to the Constitutional Court. But now, as a retired person who holds office as the Inspecting Judge of Correctional Services, I think I can answer it. And it goes back to the first question you asked, Ratinoi, which is, what is the role of rights in the epidemic? Now, one of our major cities, and I'll be careful not to name it, rounded up all homeless people and sent them out to a collective camp where it was said that they were free to go. I hope they are free to go. That was contested. But many people complained that they were, many homeless people who were on the streets of that city complained that they were coerced into going. Now, in my view, that is not compatible with proper respect for those people's rights. If those facts are correct, I'm not there to assess the facts. And I haven't seen the conflicting sets of affidavits, which are normally has the benefit of as a judge. But I would doubt that rounding up homeless people is the best way to deal with their risk in this epidemic, because you now put together many hundreds, perhaps thousands of homeless people, whereas before they were pretty isolated, keeping social distance from most other people. They were in small groups, but not in big groups. And we know that one of the reasons why it makes sense to stop sports gatherings, to stop concerts, to stop cinemas, to stop restaurants, to stop other gatherings is because those gatherings become fearful spreaders of the virus. So my fear would be that rounded up camp for homeless people in that city is going to become a source of infection and not protect people from infection.
Okay, we have another question about South Africa and the government, which is likely to extend the lockdown regulations, even though a state of emergency has not been fully declared. Militarization has become the order of the day. From a human rights perspective, how can we hold the state accountable under these conditions when some human rights have been suspended?
Well, it's already happening. My colleagues in the Constitutional Court got an urgent application from the family of a gentleman who I understand, and I haven't seen the evidence. I'm talking from newspaper reports, so I'm I'm in no privileged position more than any of our participants this evening. The man, Mr. Koza, who was in his front yard when the soldiers passed by and saw him having a drink. They've gone to the Constitutional Court and they say they do want redress for their father and breadwinner and partner who was alleged to be bludgeoned to death by those soldiers. He died a terrible death a few hours later, but they also want more. They're asking the court to issue a series of injunctions against brutality and overuse of force by the South African police and the South African National Defence Force. So we have those rights, and those rights subsist, as I said at the outset this evening, they subsist even in a state of emergency, which is one step up. A state of emergency is one step worse than a state of disaster. We're not there yet. In a state of emergency, you're entitled to infringe a certain number of basic rights in the Bill of Rights, except the right to dignity, except the right to life, except the right to equality. But many other rights may be proportionally infringed, but not so in a state of disaster. You have to respect those rights. And they are asking the court to give a structural injunction, an order that is structured to require the armed forces and the security forces, including the police, to respect all those rights.
Okay, so extending from that question, does that mean that a lockdown can never be a violation of human rights and it can just keep being extended, especially if a state of emergency gets declared? And is there a hierarchy of rights? And yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned some rights which are untouchable, but yeah.
Yes, there certainly is in the South African Bill of Rights, there's a hierarchy, the right to human dignity, the right to equality. Those rights are more inviolable than other rights. But let me say this, Ratinoi, you know, I'm subject to the lockdown. I've been working from home for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I don't go out. I've been out a handful of times to get food for my partner and for me. And that's an infringement of my right of freedom of movement. But is it justified? And this came to the fore when President Ramaphosa was challenged by the tavern owners in Soweto. And they said, why can't we continue selling liquor? And President Ramaphosa answered with a very full letter. Now, I only saw this in the media. I haven't seen it in affidavit form. But he explained why it's necessary to take away my right to purchase alcohol during this period. And he referred to figures which show that when you diminish people's alcohol consumption, crime goes down, traumatic assaults on other people go down, car crashes caused by impairment by alcohol go down. And this was proved by figures that he referred to from 2 hospitals in Cape Town, Grooteskiel and another hospital, I'm not sure whether it was Tygerberg or some other hospital in Cape Town, where the number of casualty admissions had gone down enormously after the lockdown was announced. So all of that's to come back to the question, which is that every impairment under the lockdown has got to be justified under our Section 36 of the Bill of Rights. Sections 1 to 35 say these are your rights. Section 36 says, but these rights may be limited by a law of general application that is reasonable in accordance with the laws of similar societies to ours, which takes into account the object of the law, its impact, whether it's the least possible intrusion on the right in question. And I would say, having no longer being on the Constitutional Court, that many of the lockdown provisions are in accordance with Section 36's limitation. Perhaps 1 or 2 might not be, but luckily I don't have to decide that anymore.
Thank you very much for your answer. Moving on to our next question. What do you think the current situation with COVID-19 will change and shift the ideas / conversations around universal basic income and universal healthcare provision?
Well, you tapping into my own worldview and my own value system. I personally believe that universal healthcare is indispensable in any society that calls itself civilized. Also, as no longer holding judicial office, although I still hold an office as a judge, I can say that I find it staggering beyond belief that the wealthiest society in the world doesn't have universal healthcare. I find it beggars all my systems of credulity, and that President Obama's efforts to move towards greater healthcare for the poor and the vulnerable and the aged in the United States have been treated with such venomous opposition in his own country. To me, it's very difficult, even when patient Americans explain this to me. So that's my one prejudice I have to put out there, that I think that any country of any advancement should have universal healthcare. And then maybe less defensible from an economist's point of view, I also think that a basic income grant does a great deal of good. I think there are empirical studies. There's a good debate about this, and I don't wish to diss the economists who believe differently. Some people that I rate very highly think that a basic income grant is not a good idea. My own view is that the economic evidence tends to support that. So I'm hoping that one of the things that this will have changed is our view about how you use common resources to protect people, and not just to protect them against a catastrophic virus, but to protect them against poverty, against hunger, against homelessness, against cold. And I think that public funds should definitely be used in all those cases.
Okay. Thank you for that answer as well. There has been a universal trend with domestic abuse cases being on the rise once people are asked to stay at home recently. So we have a question about domestic violence. For those who are victims of domestic abuse and who are stuck in lockdown with abuses, what options do they have to protect themselves? And what about children who are also suffering from domestic abuse? And also, I saw something in the news today, and there's people who live with violent children. So there's people in abusive situations, but it's not from someone who's even conscious of the fact that they're being abused. And just being in a situation where you have to be at home, and everyone else who also would have come to help you has to stay in that confined space. And yeah, it's just a very unique situation right now with people being exposed to abuse. So you can speak to us about the law. Thank you.
Well, I think just let's pause for a moment, Ratinoi, because imagine that you're a woman in an abusive relationship with a male partner who resorts to violence. It must be absolutely terrifying to be in a confined domestic situation, perhaps a very depleted, unresourced domestic situation, maybe an informal settlement, maybe a 1 or 2 room dwelling, and it must be truly terrifying. And we feared this. An organization with which I'm involved called LVA, which stands for Lawyers Against Abuse, which was founded by Bonnie Meisfeld, which is run in Diepsloot by outstanding people like Retabile and Lindsay. They foresaw this. One of the earliest wake-up calls I had was when Bonnie sent out an opinion piece saying that any lockdown, if it comes, is going to see a rise in violence against women who are at risk of it from their partners. And that has happened. I'm not consoled, but it's an important fact. This is not only happening in South Africa, in England as well. Authorities have reported an increase in violence against women in the home. So what can you do? It's again a question of recourse to the police. We have got a system of protection orders, not that they often do any good at all. I regret to say, as a lawyer, I'm ashamed to say that often protection orders are of very little use. But that is what the police should be doing. That is what the SANDF should be doing, which is to have a beneficent, humble, and careful, respectful enforcement of the lockdown, but also helping women and other partners who are at risk of domestic violence. That is what should be happening.
Okay. Thank you for that answer as well. Another concern, one of the ways that governments are using to manage the virus is through surveillance. So we have a question about contact tracing technology, especially mobile phone tracking, which is an important tool in controlling the epidemic, is being used by governments. However, this quick adoption of such technologies is raising concerns about privacy rights and other infringements against rights in the long run. So what can citizens across the continent do to cooperate without surrendering too much too quickly?
Well, let me say it's terrifying. The question is whether we should yield that aspect of our privacy. It is terrifying to me to think that government will be able to trace, and apparently they can already do it. I actually had to go out this afternoon to get some bread and other supplies for us here at home. And I walked a short way to one shop, and then I walked a short way to a mall. And in fact, it seems that I could be traced through pings from the cell phone tower. My colleague, Justice Cato Regan, who was with me in the Constitutional Court until she had to retire because of her term limit in October 2009. She is now based at Oxford, but Minister Ronald Lamola asked her to be the oversight judge. So they are planning to trace all our contacts, but to make weekly reports to the oversight judge. So again, to me, it seems, and I don't have to sit in judgment on whether that is going to be a constitutional system, but I can say that I'm very, very grateful indeed to Justice O'Regan for being willing to do this terribly arduous job of checking up whether the use made by government of the cell phone data is in keeping with our right to security and good health and protection.
Okay. With an extension from that.
Can I add one thing, Ratinoi, please, just to add one thing. I think we've got to be very careful when this epidemic is over. And I'm careful to say when it's over, because people used to say when AIDS is over. I fear we're going to be living with AIDS into your children's generation and perhaps even the generation after that. We've been waiting for nearly 40 years for a magic bullet to end AIDS. We haven't found it yet. I'm on antiretrovirals for 22 years now. I'm very grateful for them. They're keeping me very healthy. It would be a great convenience if I could take one pill or one treatment and not have HIV in my body anymore. But I think with COVID as well, we're going to be living with it for quite a few years, regretfully. But when it's over, we've got to be very careful to take all our rights back. We can't let strong men, and most of these people are men like me, we can't let strong men use the opportunity of the justified incursions on our rights in order to save us from catastrophe to linger afterwards. We have to be assertive, we have to be vigilant as citizens, and we have to take back our rights afterwards.
Thank you. Just to extend from that, you can quickly comment on this. What do you think of people who've been quarantined having to wear wristbands linked to their smartphones for alerting the authorities if they break the quarantine, and also measures such as people like governments installing CCTV on the doors of quarantined individuals to ensure they don't leave? Is this a bit too far, or what do you think of that?
Well, it's hard. You know, you're asking me, and I'm not a public health expert. Let's take it from 2 points of view. Right, let all of us collectively stop for a moment and do a mind game. Let's think of that person who is suspected to have acquired COVID, and if this person goes out, he or she may become a super spreader, even just going to the shops, because we don't know exactly how this is transmitted. It must be terrible to have a wristband. It must be terrible to have every exit from your home watched by the beady eye of Big Brother from the state. Now let's switch our mind game to the person in the lift, to the person at the counters, the person on the street, to the person at the spaza shop, the informal trader's stall, who's going to encounter that person. Whose rights should matter there? It's a question of weighing them up, and it's not easy to do. Ask me, and I would say that for a limited period, under proper judicial supervision, that kind of intrusion may well be justified. But I can accept that many people listening to us this evening may say, oh, why is he saying that? He's so wrong. But cautiously, tentatively, provisionally, I would think that with identified cases of COVID or highly at-risk people, that kind of limited surveillance would be justified.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question about, in the event that there's a state of emergency, several countries deny the right of religion. Can states deny the rights of religious practice and belief to religious groups, especially for Muslims, with the Ramadan coming soon, in the event that there is a state of emergency?
Ratinoi, just give me the nub of the question. I apologize if my concentration wandered for one moment.
Oh, it's fine. So can the state of emergency enforced in several countries deny the right of religion, belief, and practice to religious groups, especially for Muslims who have Ramadan coming soon?
Okay. Well, we've already denied it to two groups. We're talking about the great Abrahamic monotheistic religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Now, Jews weren't allowed to have their Passover celebration, which for many Jews was a profound intrusion on their religious observances. The Seder on the evening of Passover is a profound moment when large family groups and non-Jewish guests are able to come together and celebrate the Passover. This did not happen this year because people were kept in isolation. So people did it by Zoom, as we are doing now by WebEx or by other Skype applications. And then Easter came up just after that. And in South Africa, we've got the Zion Church of Maria, led by Bishop Barnabas Lekhanyani. And sometimes the figures of the stats of people going to Moria outside Polokwane, I'm told that it's between 3 and 5 million people who go. That was barred. So we already have that. I find it more difficult. I think with Ramadan, they would prevent church services, sorry, I don't mean church services, but gatherings in the mosque when the fast is broken at the end of every day, prayers. And I fear that may well happen, but I hope it's going to happen in consultation with Islamic leaders, because of course, one of the worst consequences of the rise in secular and separatist nationalism has been Islamophobia. And one of my friends who I believe is listening in tonight, Samar Ali, who's a Tennessean of Palestinian and Syrian extraction, who was brought up in the Islamic faith, she's doing extraordinary work to counter the hateful levels of irrational, vituperative, toxic Islamophobia in the United States, which, again, I might say, the national leadership in the United States grievously and scandalously is not doing much to counter.
Okay, thank you for that
question. So I haven't answered your question really, Ratinoi, I admit that. It's hard to say how it will affect, but I would point to the fact that Christians and Jews were also curtailed, and that might also have to happen in relation to Islamic prayers at the breaking of the fast every day during Ramadan.
Yes, and I guess even though these public gatherings are very integral to the religion and the practice, at least with the lockdown and whatever measures that are taken, you're still able to practice your religion privately and pray and do everything that you can within the confines of your home. So I guess it won't be like completely limited. Yeah.
I mean, it's a question, and I haven't asked my friends who operate within the Islamic belief system whether that's possible, whether you could have a video conference to have the prayers at the breaking of the fast every day. I'd be interested, perhaps, if there's someone who was brought up in that faith, maybe they can answer that for us now, Ratinoi.
Okay, I'll look out for the comments if someone answers it.
I'd love to hear.
Okay. Our next question is from Dashan Naika, and he's asking what provision South Africa is making to protect non-citizens, and what about the rights of, what about the access of refugees to the Child Protection Grant, for example? So let me repeat that. What is the South African government doing to protect non-citizens? What about access of refugees to the Child Protection Grant, for example?
Well, this is something where I don't think that I, as a South African, have done very well, I regret to say. The Constitutional Court, before I joined it, gave a wonderful decision by Justice Edwin Cameron called Khoza, the Khoza case, which said that government could not refuse non-citizens who were permanently resident in the country social grants. So if you've got permanent residence, you've got to get the child support grants, you've got to get the disability grant, you've got to get the old age grant, you've got to get all those grants. But those don't extend, so far as I know, to cross-border migrants, to undocumented non-citizens, and to refugees. And I think this is grievous. I might be misinformed here, but I don't think that that if you're an asylum seeker, I don't think you get any grant. You may get entitlement to grant if you've been granted refugee status. I should find that out, but I'm not going to guess right now. But I don't think we've done well. Your questioner asks, what are we doing to protect them? Well, in the letter that I signed today to the Minister of Justice, which was signed by Detention Justice Forum and all its constituent members, we ask him to release from jail all undocumented migrants who are inside prison on cross-border migrancy charges.
Okay. I'd just like to notify everyone that we have just over 8 minutes left of the interview, so we'll be taking only 2 to 3 questions, unfortunately, but yeah, time is against us. So
I'll try to be short.
Okay. The next question we have is about, so what do you have to say about the harvesting, sharing, and storage of health data? There is a sense that a pandemic of this nature may open up health data harvesting that may not necessarily happen during normal times.
Yeah.
What do you think of this?
I don't know much about that, but I think much of our previous discussion applies to that as well. Let me give you an example. The way we knew in 1990, 0.08% of South Africans had HIV. 5 years later, when we'd become a democracy in 1995, that figure was 5%. 5 years later, in 2000, it had zoomed up into the 20%. How did we know that? We knew through sentinel sites, which were sexually transmitted disease clinics, and most importantly of all, antenatal care clinics, where pregnant women would go. That's why women bore the brunt of the AIDS epidemic, because they were diagnosed first. They had to take their diagnosis back home. Often they suffered partner assault. They suffered family ostracism and victimization. So the point I'm making is a roundabout point, but it's an important point, which is that sharing of health data can be very important. I think your questioner is rightly scared and rightly skeptical that this could be done abusively. And we've got to find a way to use data like that, like it was used in the AIDS epidemic, to say, look at what's happening. This is our national prevalence. This is where we are, but not to use it for commercial gain, not to use it for privacy intrusions. And I think that our systems are sophisticated enough to do that. I mean, look at something that I heard today on the BBC. Facebook says we're powerless against all these lies and hateful and bots, but they've managed to shut them down in the COVID epidemic. They've stopped lies, and Twitter has as well. Why didn't they do it also for Islamophobia? Why didn't they do it also for Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism? So I think the point I'm making is this, Ratinoi, that we've got sophisticated enough IT systems to permit certain beneficial uses, but not permit exploitative or illicit uses of all of our data.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I think we should be moving into the last 2 questions that we have today. Some of the youth in Africa are currently working hard to come up with novel situations to solve various present and post-COVID-19 situations. How do we protect the intellectual property rights during this time while simultaneously trying not to mute the entrepreneurship passions? And this is from Joyce from Kenya.
Thank you very much, Joyce. I'm very glad that you've joined us this evening. I would give the answer that I gave earlier. I would use some system adapted from Professor Thomas Podgy of Yale. I would say that we should be rewarding people, not necessarily through the present clunky and unjust and outdated intellectual property patent system and various systems like that. But I hope that we will have enterprise. I hope that we will have entrepreneurs in Kenya and South Africa and Zimbabwe, Botswana, elsewhere, who will come up with innovative solutions. And I hope that they will be rewarded, but I'm not sure that our present system of intellectual property protection is the best way to reward them.
Okay, thank you for your answer. We have a question here. How do we carefully and intentionally share innovations in vaccines and treatments for COVID-19, knowing that the US president and other leaders on the continent in the past have spread dangerous misinformation as research continues?
Well, Ratinoi, that's also a wonderful question. I think it goes back to where we started an hour ago, community strength. There was a beautiful article on one of our news agencies earlier this week about the Amadiba community in the Eastern Cape. It's a traditional community in a rural setting that used the skills it had gained during the AIDS epidemic to deal with COVID-19. And one of the skills was community solidarity. The second skill was non-discrimination against anyone in the community. And the third skill was the use and application of proper scientific data. What do we know about HIV? What do we know about how it's transmitted? What do we know about COVID? What do we know about how it's transmitted? So I'm taking us back to the power of community. I'm taking us back to the power of human solidarity. We are living in a time of catastrophe, a time of fear, a time of terrible uncertainty. Ratinoi, if I may be personal, I think it's worse for you as a young person. I'm 67 now. I've had a chance. I've had wonderful chances. I had a second chance after getting onto antiretrovirals. I'm profoundly grateful for that. But I think it must be even more scary for a young person like you setting out on your career, for the young people at the ALA, at the Leadership Academy this evening. So I think we need to dig deep into our commitment to each other as humans, as people who care for each other, and find ways of dealing after this epidemic with the fact that we're still humans, not allow the exploiters and the ultra exploiters and the ultra accumulators to take away our dignity after this.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that will have to be our last question, but I really like how you wrapped it up and went back to some of the things we had said previously. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and for the questions, and I'd like to encourage people to keep answering each other's questions and discussing in the dialogue section. I'd like to now hand over to Kalalelo at the African Leadership Academy to give a vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Kalalelo from South Africa, and I'm the coordinator for the Executive Speaker Seminar, such as the one we've just had right now here at ALA. So I'd like to firstly thank Ratinoi very much for facilitating and hosting us tonight. I think it's always so heartwarming when ALA alumni jump on the opportunity to stay connected and to continue to serve the ALA community, so thank you for that. I'd also like to extend heartfelt gratitude to Justice Cameron. Thank you so much for your insights and your time tonight. I think to say that having someone of your expertise and caliber return to speak to us here at the ALA community is such an honor. That is an understatement in itself, but nonetheless, thank you very much, and we hope to have you back soon to speak to us. To every single attendee who has joined us tonight, we have also been streaming live on Facebook, but to everybody else who's joining us all around from the world, and a special shout out to attendees from the African continent. We see we have people from Botswana, from DRC, from Uganda, and across the continent really. Thank you for joining us. I'm still inviting you all to please send us your recommendations for any incredible speakers or industry experts that you feel may be available and willing to speak to us here at ALA. Please send your recommendations over to us on info@africanleadershipacademy.org. africanleadershipacademy.org. That's info@africanleadershipacademy.org. So the webinar series continues next week with Dr. Zuki Swazingela, who will be speaking to us on health workers, mental health, obviously in the context of the current COVID-19. So we hope that you will join us. Please look up for that invite, register, and we'll see you same time next week. Otherwise, from myself and the rest of the ALA team, good night and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.